and to giving me an opportunity to revisit this book, which, as you said, Jennifer, I published 17 years ago. And it's really interesting to see how it circulates and recirculates. It seems to have a life of its own. I don't hardly ever try and promote it, but people hold on to it at certain moments when particular questions arise. And I'm really interested in how contemporary scholars are also expanding the analysis that I made in Space Invaders. You will know that I started from the kind of very formal world of the senior civil service and Parliament in England. I did 100 interviews for this book, but recently, my recent students, Yichin Zhang, who's just presented this morning actually to my class, has used the notion of Space Invaders to look at the gendered spaces of snooker halls in China, and it's an exemplary dissertation which I'm sure will be published in some form. And also the MA student and DJ sound systemer June Reed presented to us this morning. June is from a duo, a female duo that's been running for 30 years. And she's used the book as well as other concepts to note how this notion of feeling like space invaders and being treated like space invaders has continued intergenerationally. Now, I have myself expanded and gone off in different organizations to think about space invaders. I've been invited by the Space Invaders group, in fact, from the museum world, to look at what happens with race and gender in certain positions. And it's also been taken up by places I never expected to, such as scientists, the police force. Women of colour in the police force have looked at this. And so over the course of those 17 years, I have been expanding or rethinking, working with the analytical framework in different ways. Now, overall, how we inhabit and belong in space and flesh, as flesh and stone, defines the parameters of the issues I'm concerned with, and how questions of invisibility and invisibility and visibility sit together, and exclusion and inclusion sit together. So these are kind of the pairs that have been always interesting me. Now, clearly, as noted by the feminist political philosopher Elizabeth Grosz, we live and move in space as bodies in relation to other bodies. And each living body produces itself in space, as it also produces that space, says the male geographer Henri Lefebvre. But there's also, as Elizabeth Grosz points out in her lecture she gave many years ago, Inside Outside, to the Architectural Association, there's always the ongoing possibility of a different inhabitation. And I guess here is the scope for change as well as repetition, and the change that many of you are trying to work through in the German higher education system. I'd like to start with a world famous figure. That is a statue of David in Italy, Florence, and this 4 meters and 10 centimeters symbol of masculine, passionate strength and wrath was taken in to protect him from the elements to the Academy Gallery in 1873. And in 2004, I stumbled across him accidentally when I was visiting Florence. And the gallery were marking the 500th birthday of David. To do this, they commissioned 5 international contemporary artists. And one of the artists, Robert Morris, created a piece called The Birthday Boy. And in this 2-screen, wall-size screens, you have 2 lecturers, one female, the other male, drinking a lot of wine and asking us in a very deadpan, animated manner Why have we cleaned up David? Why have we taken him in from the elements? Why are we protecting him? And as they discuss this and narrate it, David changes on one screen to a black woman, and on the other screen turns into a elder man, and also is toppled over. This piece, at the very least, invites us to demythologize the heroic figure of leadership, what we could call the somatic norm. Now, we are living in a very interesting moment, a juxtaposition of inhabitation, and you can see it on the screen here, where we have new bodies taking up places which have historically and conceptually not been reserved for them, for us. And this is a perfect example of the proximity of the outside on the inside, and a pointer to the differentiated degrees of inclusion and the contradictions that operate with that inclusion. Now, amidst the contestation of David, it doesn't matter how much we demythologize him metaphorically, we still step into this figure's space. David is in many ways the yardstick, the somatic norm that we become measured by. And this happens in academia, in art, politics, law, multiple arenas. So when we discuss diversity in institutions, so often the emphasis on counting bodies, how many are there? And there's this emphasis on arrival. And I agree that this is important. The numbers are important. They are important indicators, actually. They're an alert, and they tell us something about the conditions of exclusion, but also how the conditions of exclusion are already premised on particular conditions of inclusion. I'm always interested in understanding exclusion by trying to look at what are the conditions of inclusion when we look at the outsiders on the inside, but also when you look at the normative figures. What are their conditions of inclusion? What are their processes? Increasingly, gendered and post-colonial bodies are taking up positions which have historically and conceptually not been reserved for them. And of course, legally they enter, re-enter, and they're there, that's evidence of that. But informally, they continue to not be the somatic norm. Those positions, because they're not reserved for them, they're not the somatic norm. Now, this doesn't mean that they're in a straightforward position of being marginal. We need to be careful, but rather we need to look at the tenuous, we need to look at the tenuous location that they occupy. And this is a contradictory space in institutions of the insider, outsider in relationship. And I wouldn't say the dynamics are the same across all institutions. It very much depends on the ecology of institutions too. And it'll be interesting to hear in the chat and the questions at the end through the chat, if this frame that I've been developing over time applies to your institution and your walks of life. So I've noted that there are particular processes that happen in this dynamic of the outside on the inside. And these processes point towards how there's a change happening, but at the same time, there's a sedimentation. So there's shift and entrenchment. This is happening at the same time. And there are space invaders, but many of the space invaders do not feel like fish in water. They feel like fish out of water. And I'll explain that in a moment. Before I let you know that the space invaders word was taken from Doreen Massey, geographer, feminist geographer, when she discusses being a woman on the football terraces today. but being conscious of being a space invader while enjoying and loving football. Now, thinking about this notion of fish in and water, Pierre Bourdieu, who I've used quite a bit in this analysis, discusses that when an habitus, so the habitus is the history incarnated in a body, when you encounter a social world of which you are a part, then you are like fish in water. You are of that world, and you don't feel the weight of that water. And you take the world around you for granted. It's not even visible to you sometimes, actually. But a Black sociologist, Simmons, wrote many years ago in a classic text called Black British Feminism, edited by Heidi Mercer. She wrote that as a Black female sociologist, in this white world, I am a fresh water fish that swims in seawater. I feel the weight of the water on my body. So although she's of the world, she also feels she's not in the quite right waters. The waters are not right for her. And one of the core features of the power of whiteness lies in this positional privilege of being racially unmarked and unnoticed and invisible. This has been, tracked by lots of scholars of race, Bell Hooks, Goldberg, Mills, who recently passed away. I used him extensively in my work, Charles Mills. And Charles Mills notes that the fish do not see the water, and white people do not see this racial nature of a white polity because it's natural to them, the element in which they move. Now, thinking through the lens of inclusion, the terms of inclusion, and this notion of the weight of the water, who feels the weight of the water, this notion of ontological complicity, again developed by Bourdieu, but he didn't develop it with reference to race, it's mainly with class. He argues that if you're of that world, the world that you've, in terms of family, educational background, and the world of work, if you're of that world, then you are experiencing what he calls ontological complicity. The demands made of you come to you automatically. Automatically, you have a feel for the game. And this helps us to think about the fish in and out of water. And you immediately adapt to a situation. And Simmons highlights to us how her Black lecturing, in her case, sociology lecturing body, is something that's out of place in academia. It's not. It's there, it's swimming, it's moving, but at the same time, it's not exactly the normative body. So while we're having this conversation on diversity, multiculturalism, it's important to pause and to think, how are we seeing a form of diversity where new bodies are entering and arriving? What is happening in this process of what Gayatri Spivak refers to as a multicultural hunger? There's a multicultural hunger operating, and it's a fraught and complicated multicultural hunger in operation, and looking at our own situation as a diasporic Indian, sometimes traveling first class academic in North America. She says, I'm often invited to speak today for the precise reason I wasn't in the past. And her words invite us to interrogate what kind of speaking position is made available. What is she expected to speak about? What is she not expected to speak of? On whose behalf is she expected to speak? And in fact, how is she invited? There's a real ready-made audience that expect her to speak of the third world woman. She argues to be confessional, to be autobiographical, and to be anthropological. But she argues she's a disappointment if she speaks on Derrida, whom she translated at an extremely young age, And even if she does speak of Derrida marks, which will she be heard? And there are ethnic and gendered slots within the public domain that straitjacket belonging to specific formations. So before I embark on the notion of being a space invader, fish in and out of water, I think it's important to stress that we as women of colour lecturers are not entirely fish out of water. But this needs to be understood. In fact, we've managed to enter academia, and we're not totally in the margins. We have some degree of training, capital, cultural capital, social capital. We do have the dispositions and habitus that allow us to be in the space. To say that we don't have those would, in my view, be bad faith. But at the same time, the fish in and out of water alerts us to the fact that when we consider race, we are specialist language speakers in academia. At the same time, we've been able to enter these ranks. However, regardless of however much we may be steeped in the what Bourdieu calls the practical mastery of the airs, the graces, the languages, the academic specialisms of our field, on the grounds of race and gender together, we don't represent the somatic norm, and there are certain ways in which the fish and in and out of water is a phenomenon. And I'm going to offer the kind of brief tool for making sense of this and this framework that allows us to think about the tenuous location of the fish in and out of water, the outsiders on the inside. And as I said, these processes do signal change, but they also signal entrenchment and the sedimented depth of racialized and gendered forms of making of space. So the first dynamic I want to discuss in thinking about differentiated forms of inclusion in the tenuous location is disorientation. And some of you may know from the book I discussed this with reference to Winston Churchill in 1990 when the first woman entered the House of Commons amongst, over 600 men. He was asked how he felt about this woman being in the House of Commons, and he said, "Oh, I feel as if she's entered my bathroom and don't even have a sponge with which to cover myself." And there's this sort of motion of ontological anxiety, actually, that happens in that process. So this led me to think about disorientation, how the outsiders actually disorient those who belong. They disorient the normative positioning of academia. And it can come with what we could phrase as a double take, where people look twice, they think again. Is this what I'm seeing in front of me? Is this an academic? And in terms of academia, I'm going to draw mainly on examples from academia today because of the subject of our topic. The double take often accompanies the knowledge that you're a lecturer without, the elderly kind of bearded professor persona, and especially happens if Black lecturers appear, as Spivak points out, for a lecture on Marx or some kind of classical European philosophy. And students might think, is this a lecture? Am I in the right room? Depending on the age of the lecturer. Is this a student? So there's this level of being disorientated, and because they don't assume this figure to be the figure of authority in front of them. They don't automatically assume it and therefore do the double take. Now, this partly happens because of a related second process of infantilization. And I've taken this language from Frantz Fanon's work, where he's talked about this extensively. And for fantilization in terms of the academic world, lecturers, professors might be assumed to be more junior than they are. You know, they are secretaries or researchers, but they're not professors. And with infantilization, what happens is the capacities of the somatic norm, the normative figure, say the David, are imagined in a very expansive way. They seem to have, you know, a plethora of capacities. But with the outsiders, they're straitjacketed, pigeonholed, as Spivak says, but also their capacities are shrunken. They're seen in shrunken ways. And they're more likely, interestingly, to be seen to be specialists, because they live with this burden of doubt. So they're seen to be specialists rather than generalists, specialists in law, in statistics or medicine, rather than general leaders. So there's this burden of doubt that accompanies them every day, actually, where people don't expect them to quite fulfill competencies. You know, there's a slight shift of the head to the side and slight uncertainties, not even named actually. And the burden of doubt really, it comes to the fore when you think about who passes as the generalist and who sits as the sub specialist. And this is where the statement that Spivak makes about being a third world speaker, that's how she's pulled in. She argues there's specific situational contracts that emerge, and there's a perception that, you know, she'll grace a certain occupation that she's invited to speak of. And she argues in order to deal with this, she says, one of my projects is not to allow myself to occupy the place of the marginal that you would like to see me in, because then that allows you to feel that you have another and other to speak to. So there's this struggle all the time between the sectioning off and the generalist leaders. Who is a generalist leader? The burden of doubt brings along another process called super surveillance. And again, I've borrowed this from theorists of policing, of race, of immigration to develop this concept. Because people feel conspicuous or are conspicuous, there is a level of super surveillance and they exist under a spotlight. So the slightest of mistakes is picked up and amplified. And it's easily seen, in fact, to be an indicator of misplaced authority. This person is not entitled to this positionality because they are making these mistakes. But the mistakes are amplified and there's a disproportional attention paid to their behavior. So that in the academic world, the hyper-surveillance might manifest itself whereby colleagues as well as students are more likely to pick up mistakes that are made, you know, errors here and there. Student feedback forms, evaluation forms can be where, you know, students really go to town in kind of criticizing a lecturer, and also how then senior figures respond to that feedback. What do they do with it? How much weight is attached to these student complaints? What kind of flaws are tolerated? I remember once an interviewee said to me, we'll have a quality where we can be as mediocre as the others. Because mediocrity actually allows us to realize that there's some level of playing field. But at the moment, mistakes are more likely to be picked up and maybe taken further, you know, more kind of observation, a further ocular lens is put on teaching observations. This can happen a lot. And it's interesting to observe interview panels, whose mistakes are noticed on the interview panels and who's kind of got a large breadth of forgiveness. You know, it's not even noticed, in fact. And there are instances actually where lectures of colour are received with great deal of fanfare for diversifying a predominantly white faculty. But if there's a slight glitch in their job performance, then the awe and the fascination started to fall away and in fact can become manifested as and switch to disappointment. A disappointment that deserves further surveillance and disciplinary techniques. Now here I'm just going to step back into Fanon for a moment. He notes that he was a practicing psychiatrist who moved from the French colony in Martinique to Paris in France. And he made an observation about institutional racism at the time in his own sector. And he notes that, that in this amplification of mistakes, what happens, because there's a burden of doubt, he notes that infantilization and hypersurveillance come in together. So he said, and I've given you a small snippet of what he says. I'll read the full-length quote. He said, "We had physicians, professors, statesmen." This is in Martinique. But yes, but something out of the ordinary still clung to such cases. We had a Senegalese history teacher. He's quite bright. Our doctor is coloured. He's very gentle. There's always a Negro teacher, and I put that word in brackets because he's writing in the 50s. He says, "I shivered at the slightest pretext. I, for instance, as a physician, noticed that if a physician made a mistake, it would be the end of him and all of those who came after him. What could one expect of that kind of physician? And as long as everything went well, he was praised to the skies. But look out, no nonsense under any conditions," he says. "The black physician can never be sure how close he is to disgrace. I tell you," he says, "I was walled in. No exception was made for my refined manners, or my knowledge of literature, or my understanding of the quantum theory." So the margins for making mistakes are extremely small. That's what he's pointing out to us. And the tiniest error is amplified. And sometimes when further scrutiny is put in place, this can actually induce anxiety and nervousness in itself. And in itself, that scrutiny can lead to the person making lots and lots of mistakes. Now, with respect to, this happens, with respect to gender in similar but slightly separate ways as well. It can often mount to a series of personal attacks, and they can become really vicious at times, and enforce a territorial pack in an institution. Institutions do form packs, we know that, can be mobilized against the particular person. Now, the burden of doubt leads to a burden of representation where the person feels, "I have to do well because otherwise they're going to say, we place this lecturer in this position, this professor in that position, and look at them, why should we give them this space?" So they're often very conscious of not letting the so-called side down, even though they're not there as a representative, but they're seen to be. Now, just as there's an amplification of mistakes, there's also an amplification of bodies. So because they're not the somatic norm, one or two can be amplified in imagination as being 4 or 5. And there's this kind of sense that they're taking up more space than they are, which is what was happening in this, sort of similar way with Winston Churchill. Now, we're aware of the optics of diversity, where 1 or 2 persons of colour in an organisation are granted a lot of visibility in all the advertising, the marketing, in PR materials, even though the organisation has very few people of colour in those ranks. And as well as there's an amplification of bodies, there's something else that occurs too. The merging of bodies, and some of you might recognize this. Different figures get merged and confused, taken away from the specific strengths and legacies of each of those persons. And it's an interesting question. How many men, the normative men, get confused for each other? How many of them do get confused? Or how many are remembered for their specialism? And merging is a form of erasure in itself, not being able to listen or remember the distinctive contributions of specific academics. And due to name, I've often been confused with the theorist Jasbir Puwar. And believe it or not, I've visually been mistaken for, it's very flattering, but I don't buy it, for Arundhati Roy, and it can amount to an amnesia of academic contributions in every way. Now, in thinking about the process of exclusion, as I said at the start, it's really important to pay attention if you want to understand the dynamics, to not think it's a mystery why this exclusion is happening, but to think about what are the dynamics for becoming our insiders. And this question leads us to think about, you know, all the ways in which one comes to be inside an occupation and in certain levels of the hierarchy. We know that endorsement is central in all occupations. In our occupation, it's especially central. For students, it's central. For staff, it's central. You need references. And these references are rather like in immigration terms, they're endorsements. It's as if the sponsors are, you know, opening the doors for you. And the more respected the figures are who write your endorsements, the more weight they carry in the Bourdieuian sense, the more likely you are to achieve certain, you know, positions in an organization. So endorsement happens in lots of ways, and alongside endorsements, it's always to think about how are you included. I mean, in our area, although we pride ourselves on being an open space, we know that patronage is actually still quite big. Patronage happens through, you know, who's asked to write, who's asked to review, who's asked to sit on certain committees, and who's asked to speak, and the weight of those speaking positions. These are all, we know, avenues to visibility and recognition in academia. So it's worth thinking about what are the avenues to visibility and recognition anywhere, in any profession. And they're always underlined by networks of mentoring and of small recommendations that have huge, big consequences for life chances. And academia is not therefore sustained by some neutral mechanical machinery of measurement. It is through cliques of human beings that we come to be where we are. There are connections, there are other ways in which one is granted the seat. And my final way of reflecting on inclusion, I want to turn to someone who's well known now, but struggled to be known in the academic landscape. Du Bois in America, the geographer, the sociologist. And David Sibley in the Geographies of Exclusion discusses how in urban geography, the Chicago school was very famous, and Robert Parks was one of the leading figures of authority in the Chicago school at the university. But he argues that despite the amount of work that Du Bois did on urban space, race relations, the city, in very inventive ways, actually, using visual sociology before its time, he wasn't actually granted the endorsement from Park partly because Park didn't appreciate the methods he used. His philosophical approaches were in agreement with his own. And this points towards how you're more likely to become an insider if you're outsider, if you participate in social cloning. So if you can be seen to be a clone, and there's an element of mimicry in there that's happening. So there's a reproduction, there's a likeness that appears. And this can be in comportment, in manner, in the habitus, but also in the cliques that you're sitting with, the theoretical persuasions that you're a part of, the politics that you may or may not be a part of. And collegiate support and patronage within departments and disciplines is vital for everyone, but especially important for those who are historically and conceptually the outsiders. And I think it's something for all of us to reflect on. How are you included? And once you start engaging in that question, it opens up the institution in totally different ways. And you can ask this not only of academic staff, but also of students in academia too. So I'll stop there. I haven't looked at the chat.